today we'll be talking about building applications on blockchains, specifically on Polkadot, because we have the Runtime Lead at the Web3 Foundation for Polkadot here with Joe Petrowski. Hey, mate.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Excited to dive into this. Hey, Sohail here. Thanks for tuning in. Real quick before we begin, if you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something, please consider to follow or subscribe or share this episode. That helps us out a lot. It helps us to reach more people and to spread quality education across the space about crypto and Web3. Also, if you're part of a crypto project or represent one and you would like to come on the show or do sponsoring, please get in touch with us. And lastly, everything we talk about today is for educational purposes and no financial advice. Enjoy the show. All right, thank you for tuning into another episode of the TEACHMEDEFI podcast. Excited to dive into this. A little background on how we ended up here. We had Sean Tabrizi on recently. He really recommended after the podcast to have you on and talk about some of the things that are planned for Polkadot. So yeah, I'm just excited to hear your take on all the things that are being built at the moment.
Yeah, sure. We have a lot going on. So however you want to start.
Sweet. Yeah, you must be busy with everything going on. So thank you for taking the time to be here. Let's start. Let's start with how did you become the runtime lead behind a major blockchain at the Web3 Foundation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I guess if you stick around a startup long enough, then you end up getting promoted a little bit. But I've had a variety of roles. I started out actually as a research analyst and ended up moving into like the integration side. So helping a lot of like wallets and custodians and exchanges support Polkadot from the moment it launched. Like I think we were the first protocol that Coinbase actually supported from Genesis. So like I worked with them on that. And then when it came to we were talking to Tether about launching USDT on Polkadot, and we didn't have this functionality in the relay chain. And we were getting close to the point where we were ready to launch parachains. And so we thought let's make a parachain especially for holding assets like stablecoins. And since I had kind of worked with like Bitfinex and Tether anyway, I just kind of became the guy working on that project. And then we launched the first parachain, which is called Asset Hub. And then it has like this environment where you can launch assets. And we launched USDT and eventually USDC there. And started building out like more of these parachains and moving like more of this functionality into parachains instead of on the relay chain. And that started to grow a bit. And then, if you kind of go forward a couple of years, like a lot of this functionality like bridges and XCM, if you're building multiple parachains, they're talking to each other with XCM, they're using Frame, all this stuff. And then like kind of in the organization, we just ended up kind of moving these teams together. And I've been like almost 6 years now working on Polkadot. And I guess I just became the guy to become the lead of this group.
That's awesome. 6 years is a long time. I think it's always pretty. It's always nice to kind of see the people behind all of this. If you use, if you're like a crypto user and you use Polkadot, it's nice to know the people who are building behind the scenes. So I don't know. Is there like a specific memorable moment, perhaps, that you've had over these 6 years that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I mean, good and bad, of course. Yeah, I mean, launching, I guess, Asset Hub on Kusama was like the first parachain that was actually working, that's really cool. Because you really don't know if it's going to work until it happens. Yeah, I mean, and also like some of the more recent stuff, like launching Polkadot Kusama Bridge, Polkadot Ethereum Bridge, these things took years to do. Same with core time. Like it was, I think, a year ago, like June of last year, that we even put forward this idea of having agile core time instead of auctions. And it just went live on Kusama like 3 months ago. And I think it should be live on Polkadot kind of like end of August, early September. So actually seeing these things turn into reality is super exciting. And it is like the most exciting part for me about working on Polkadot is just like there are so many projects out there that are on one end of like the spectrum, either like they're they talk about like Web3 and decentralization and like, no banks, no Facebook, all of this, but like they don't really have anything except a PowerPoint presentation. And then you get like the other end of the spectrum where it's like, yeah, we're doing like Web3 and like Ethereum and stuff, and it's really like, some bank is just running like a private Ethereum chain like in their basement, right? And there's like, it's not really like using like public infrastructure. So I think it's really cool. Like something on Polkadot that we do is like we have all these crazy ideas, and some of them like they have kind of rough launches. Like you see like the fellowship and stuff is like doesn't always work as smoothly as you hoped. But the fact that we actually take these ideas and turn it into real software, I'm losing track of like the number of things that we've done, but it's always really exciting.
What are some of the crazy ideas you're working on at the moment?
I mean, yeah, a lot of stuff around like treasuries and collectives and governance. And then, of course, there's like this whole Jam project that is being led by Gav, as kind of like the next generation of Polkadot. But yeah, in the more like 1 to 2 year timeline, a lot of stuff around collectives and treasuries. And um, actually, I'll kind of like pivot a little bit on my answer, and
Yeah.
a lot of the things that people who are building on Polkadot have asked for is actually fewer new features and more stability. Like
Mm.
we've maybe been too good at shipping new exciting features, but it also means that those come with breaking changes sometimes, and people have to keep up. And so, one of the biggest requests that we get is like no new features, just stabilize things. So it's maybe not like the shiniest, most exciting answer, but it's actually like a big focus for the next year. Like, how can we just make this a bit more stable and friendly for new people to come develop on?
Right, right. Yeah, I had heard this before as well. Was it like runtime upgrades, for example, that they would have breaking changes? Is that
Yeah,
part of it?
I mean, there's like a whole set of categories of breaking changes, right? Like you can have breaking changes in the runtime upgrades that maybe change like if you have like a breaking change in the XCM format, how chains communicate with each other. But even like in our frame libraries, if you have a breaking change to how a module is configured, everybody who's using that module has to update
Mm.
and adapt to that breaking change. So that just distracts them from working on their own custom business cases. And so, yeah, we're really trying to minimize that as much as possible.
Right. And how are you getting on with that? Are you making progress? And what kind of is there anything you could talk about what you're trying to do so that it becomes more stable to develop applications on Polkadot?
Yeah, for that you should really have this guy Oliver on. But we're really committing to like a more standard release process, much more documentation around changes. So now every time you make a change, you also have to add some documentation about that change. And we've
Mm.
added a lot of automation, so that when we publish a release, it goes and collects the list of all the change documentation that people have wrote, and it will write this up and say, hey, here for this audience, these are the changes that are concerning to you. And so, yeah, we're getting better at that. And then also having like proper versioning and release cycles of everything. We're also working on this project called an OmniNode, which is like, this is maybe getting a little bit into the weeds of Polkadot, but like
Hmm.
you can generally divide development into two categories. One is the node side and one is the runtime side. And so the node is like, it has the database, the networking, the consensus, the block authorship, like everything that needs to happen to actually produce blocks and run the infrastructure of the network. But it's completely abstracted away from what kind of logic that network has. And that logic is what's in the runtime, right? And so most people, if they're building a parachain, they want to focus on building the runtime. That's where like their business logic of their application is. But for the last couple of years, we've also forced them to maintain this node that will author blocks for them as well. And so that doesn't work very well because that's not the thing that they want to focus on, right? Like they don't want to develop node infrastructure. And so we've been working on this project called the OmniNode, where this one node can run any parachain that's built with the Polkadot SDK. And that way, people don't have to maintain that anymore. They can just focus on their runtime, and they can use this one node, and it completely removes any kind of like breaking change overhead or development
Mm.
maintenance that they have to do. And it's also nice on the other side, like for the integration side, right? Because like if you're a Coinbase and you want to support all these parachains, you have to run the nodes for all of them. And if you have 20 parachains and you have 20 different binaries, that's just 20 different sets of software you have to check to mine the latest version. I keep track of all like the versions and everything that you're using. But if you have one node that you can use and you just say like, I want to run Asset Hub on this node and I want to run Moonbeam on this node, and it just works, then that makes the integration side of things much easier as well.
Interesting. So in that case, if you'd have runtime upgrades, theoretically, with some breaking changes, that node would not be affected anymore.
Correct.
Okay. And are these collator nodes then, if you're running different parachains?
They can be. So collator node is like specifically a parachain node that authors blocks, but you can also have a parachain node that is just like a normal full node.
Gotcha. And let's say we have people listening right now, like developers listening right now that are not familiar with Polkadot, are considering building an application on a blockchain. What would you say to them why they should build it on Polkadot versus perhaps like other chains?
Yeah, it really depends what type of application you want to build and what layer of the stack that you're in. Are you talking about like people who want to develop their own chain or people who want to use blockchains that already exist?
I guess we could talk about both.
Yeah. So like for people who want to build their own chain, this was kind of like one of the original value propositions of Polkadot, right? Is like if your chain logic is, or if your application logic is too complicated to express in smart contracts, or maybe you want your chain logic to be upgradable, and you can't do that in smart contracts, then you can build your own parachain on Polkadot, and you get the same kind of security guarantees that you get by deploying a smart contract on something like Ethereum, right? Because like if you deploy a smart contract on Ethereum, you don't have to worry about Ethereum security. You just get that from Ethereum, right? And so, but the problem with that is like everybody's sharing that same security, but they're also sharing the same processing core. So if one application becomes popular, it makes every other application expensive and slow to use. And so the parachains on Polkadot, they have the same security, so they don't have to worry about that, just like deploying a contract on Ethereum, but they don't affect each other. So if one parachain is getting a lot of use, it doesn't affect your parachain. So you can still have like stable fees and economics and everything. Apart from that, what we did learn is that like it is a little bit more operational overhead to maintain and run a parachain than maybe we had hoped for. There are a lot of applications that probably do make sense as smart contracts. So yeah, if we kind of move to like the next layer of how you would want to build applications on blockchains or Polkadot, like I think like the one mistake that a lot of application developers make is they kind of show the chain, right? They're kind of like, oh, you should use this application on Ethereum, or you should use this application on this specific parachain of Polkadot.
Right.
And you really should be trying to hide that. Like the blockchain part should be seen kind of analogous to like backend infrastructure, right? So most people probably don't know what like EC2 or S3 is, right? But you can still go to a website and use it, and you don't even know that it's running on those things. And what we have specifically in Polkadot is that we have all of these chains that are almost like different services, right? So you can have like a chain that specializes in identity services, a chain that specializes in assets. Like you could have one that's just for NFTs, one for fungible assets, or like in our case, we have one for both. A chain for DAOs, right? So you have all these different building blocks. And I see a lot of applications, they try to push the chain first. And so they try to say like, hey, you should use the DAO chain, or like we call it the collectives chain, right? And actually like, no, you should use the application that's on that chain, and you shouldn't have to know what chain it's on. And this is becoming increasingly a problem because a lot of applications are actually across multiple chains. So if you look at like the collectives on Polkadot, they all have their own treasury. So you have like one chain that actually manages who are the members of this this collective. What are the rules about joining and getting promoted in the collective? Like, what are your voting rights in this collective? And they have a treasury on another chain that's called Asset Hub, right? So if you want to like have an application, it doesn't make sense to say like, oh, you should check out the collectives chain, right? You have to show information about all of these different chains, and you should actually try to hide the chains from people.
Interesting. So do you think we've been basically too chain centric in our thinking, or in the Polkadot ecosystem, or perhaps also beyond, versus application centric? Because there's also this debate about like, where's the utility, where are the actual applications built that have been promised to run on this trustless infrastructure in Web3, right? There's a lot of infra fatigue as well. Like at ECC, that was one of the themes after the conference, that people felt fatigued by all the infra that's being built, and where are the applications? Is that something that you feel like as well?
Yeah. So like all the infra and chains should be hidden from people, in my opinion. You should just see the application logic. Um, I think you had a part of that, the first part of that question. I forget what it was.
Basically, if you've been too chain centric versus application centric in the
Yes.
thinking.
Yeah. So like this is kind of the original motivation of Polkadot, is that like when Ethereum was running into scaling problems, a lot of people went to build their own chain, right? And so you started to see a lot of them were just EVM clones, and then they put their contracts on their own chain, and they were basically running like either a very weak proof of stake or proof of authority something, and then they just built some like proof of authority bridge to Ethereum so that they could use their own chain, right? And uh, this actually kind of forced users to understand what chain they were using, because you want to know, hey, am I using a chain that's controlled by one person, or am I using a bridge that's controlled by what was the name of that bridge that had like 5 out of the 6 keys hacked or something, right?
Yeah, Ronin. There were so many.
Yeah,
Ronin Bridge,
yeah,
multi-chain, something.
exactly. Like there were a lot of them, so you
Yeah.
kind of have to know like, is it safe to use this chain, right? And the whole idea of Polkadot was to get rid of that. So you have all of these chains that have mutual security, and you can use all of them without worrying about, wait a minute, am I using a chain that has an insecure messaging protocol, or that doesn't have the same security guarantees as the chain that I moved my assets from? Is it safe to use this, right? Like the whole idea of Polkadot was to get rid of that worry, so that you don't actually have to know what chain you're using. And this is maybe a mistake that we made in our messaging, because like especially in the early days, parachains were the main product of Polkadot. It was like, hey, we're building this thing Polkadot. It supports parachains. You should build a parachain. And people built parachains, and they said like, well, this is really cool. I want to show it off. And so they're showing off the parachains, which I totally understand. It's like understandable, right? But if you kind of go back to the original reason that Polkadot was designed the way that it is, it was actually so that you didn't have to see all of these individual parachains. And so when people build applications on Polkadot that are built around a specific parachain rather than around the application logic, which may span multiple chains, it's not surprising that you get a bad user experience. And that's something we hear a lot, like Polkadot has bad user experience. And I want, like on the empathetic side, like I want to say like there's a lot of stuff we can do in like the runtime and frame and substrate to make it easier to build applications on Polkadot.
Right.
But on the other side, like I think application developers need to have a different mindset. Instead of showing off and instead of trying to highlight the chain that you're connected to, highlight the application, and try to hide the chains as much as possible.
Right. Is it easy enough yet to develop these applications, or is that, like you say, is that also a factor in why we're not seeing it?
I mean, nothing's ever easy enough. Like somebody will always want it to be easier.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is possible, and I've seen a few examples out there. Things are going in the right direction, and especially like getting some stability into the runtime and SDK will help with this. But I would actually rather see that it's impossible, but to get the feedback, right? Because
Right.
people kind of default to this, I know how to build on individual chains, and so that's what they do, and it's
Right.
like kind of like digging the hole deeper, right? I would rather have somebody say like, hey, I'm trying to build an application, uh, and not show the user anything about what chain they're using, and I just
Right.
found it's completely impossible. Like I can't do it. This thing sucks. Because if they say that, we can help. We can say like, hey, what was impossible? What was difficult for you to do? And we can fix that, right? But it is more difficult if people are like kind of digging into the chain hole, instead of trying to get out of it and show the application directly.
Right. Can you mention some of the examples that you've seen which you find interesting and are leveraging sort of being application centric and leveraging the different services across different chains?
Yeah, there's some stuff on like Subsquare, like and I can't remember the name of it. There's one like there's something specifically for the Polkadot Fellowship, like a UI for the fellowship, and it has like the fellows get salaries, and the salaries are actually paid out on Asset Hub, but the membership management stuff and like all the rank information is on
Mm,
the collectives chain. And so
mm,
um, you have like this UI where you can say like, I want to register for my salary, I want to claim my salary, and these are transactions that are actually going to different chains, and this application actually hides it from you, and
mm.
it just knows that like I need to submit this transaction to this chain, I need to read the info from this chain to show this to the user. So yeah, I'd like to see more stuff in that direction.
Right. And how about teaching people to do this stuff, right? Or like getting people to build these applications. Like you said, there's tooling there already. It's being improved as well. So how do we get this in the hands of people? Are there any initiatives to kind of get more developers that develop these applications?
Yeah, I know at PBA, which is Polkadot Blockchain Academy, maybe you guys know about it. They are talking about like an application track for the next session, and
Oh,
I think there's a
cool.
post on the forum about it. So maybe that's something we can look up. And they're trying to put together the curriculum of like what it looks like to build applications, or what kind of things should be taught about application development on Polkadot. I also think we can do a lot better in the tooling side, like say from like parity and developing the SDK. We have this idea we've been talking about for a while called Polkadot Facade, where you can like actually hide all of this stuff. Like there might be some configuration in the facade that says like, I want to get this from that, but overall, like the end user, or like the application developer, shouldn't have to know so much about like the architecture of
Mm,
how like the logic and state is sharded within Polkadot. So like in an ideal world, you run this like this middleware type of thing called a facade, and you just say like, get me the identity info of this account, and the facade middleware, it knows that it needs to connect to the people chain and fetch the
right.
information from there, right? And then it's just like, instead of having, I don't know how many parachains we have now, instead of having like 10 different APIs that you're using to build your application, you just have one API, and you're interacting with Polkadot as like a singular entity and not like a bunch of different components.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The easier it is to do this stuff. I mean, ideally, some of the things you don't even have to be a developer to use them. I'd say, right? I mean, I think Solana had this thing with Blinks. I think it was called Blinks, which is quite easy to use. And I think I saw someone implement a similar thing on Polkadot at the moment. Was it? I think his name was Kareem. I'm not sure,
Okay.
which was called Tap Dot, I believe. And then you just like clicked a button and it did something on chain, which usually would be more complicated to do.
Yeah, I've seen some of those examples, like some of the more complicated referenda construction that you can just do with one click, and that's really like how things should be.
Right. But having that tier in the Polkadot Blockchain Academy sounds really useful. We'll link to the academy in the show notes for any devs that are listening and will look into it. Um, one more thought I had when you mentioned being application centric versus chain centric. What about the issue of these different chains being in different places on the spectrum of decentralization, like you kind of said already? So this is like an issue. Some of the stuff is window dressing, is not really decentralized, not really secure, perhaps run in a centralized fashion. So in that case, that is the space we are operating in, right? So how can we now stop caring about the chain on which the application is running if there might be security risks?
Yeah, so there's multiple types of security risk, right? Like the security risk that you're talking about here is like a governance risk. So I guess when we say security in Polkadot, what we're talking about is finalization, right? Like we can guarantee that like if we say this parachain block is final, it's final, right? It's not going to be reverted, and we can also guarantee that the state transition within that block was done correctly. Now, if people wrote their state transition function to do corrupt things, then it's not really corrupt, right? Like it's on chain, like it was actually executed correctly. Um, and that's where I think application developers have to take more opinion, right? So like, I've kind of heard this argument before that like, oh, we shouldn't make this tool available because like you could build a parachain that is like a scam, right? And it's like,
Mm.
well, if you look at like the Uniswap protocol, right? Like at the protocol level, it doesn't actually prevent anybody from creating a pool with anything. Like you can create some scam token and you can register a pool for that, right? Like there isn't a gatekeeper that says you're not allowed to. You need to like come register with our company in order to create a pool, right? Because that would be very centralized, right?
Mm.
But then there's like a Uniswap UI, which takes opinions, right? They might choose like, I mean, I have no idea what they do if it's either like a whitelist or blacklist, but like, you know, there is an application developer that decides I'm only going to show these options to the user because I don't want them to shoot themselves in the foot, right?
Mm.
Um, and so like I think we should hide the chain specifics from end users. The
Mm.
nice thing with Web3 is that you can look under the hood, right? Like if you have open source code, you can look and see what's actually being done. But you shouldn't have to. Basically, what's being done now is like you're forcing people to when they shouldn't be required to, but they should be able to. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
difference, right? And I do think like application developers should have to take some opinion about what they're doing and say like, hey, I want to create like, I mean, keep going with like a decentralized exchange example. Like, I want to create like an application that will find the best order matching for my user and send it to the chain that will give them the best execution. And you might
Mm.
look and see that there are like 10 different options in the Polkadot ecosystem, but you might decide like, hey, two of these are, faux decentralization or they have too many risks or like, the code hasn't been audited or whatever. And you decide like, I'm not, even if these two give me better execution, I'm not going to make them an option for my users because like I don't think I think it's too risky, right? Like if something happens, my users are going to complain to me, not to those
Mm.
guys. So I do think like application like hiding or abstracting the chains, it doesn't mean that application developers don't need to have opinions or do research. You still need to understand what you're using, but you should be able to not like you should be able to abstract it from the end users.
Interesting. Okay, so abstract it away from the end users, be opinionated as the developers, so to say, and the responsibility lies there to choose credibly secure infra that you are presenting to users. Um, and I mean, it's in their interest because if something goes wrong, the users will complain to them. That's the
Yes.
right. Um, that's a little pivot again, but I'm just interested in your take. Do you think value will mainly accrue to the application layer? It is something we saw in Web 2 to some extent, where the Facebooks and Googles and Amazons of this world accrued a lot of value, whereas the infra on which they run didn't as much, right? Like telco companies famously built out all this connectivity and have struggled since the 2000s to capture value, and their market caps have gone down in some cases like more than 90%. Um, do you think this kind of like concept of an application layer mostly accruing the value versus the infra that it's running on could also happen in Web3?
It seems more difficult in Web3. This is definitely. I don't think I have a well thought out opinion to give you here.
Mm.
It it does seem more difficult though, right? Like it's, at least with what we're used to in Web3 with tokens, like more value does accrue in the protocol layer. Um, but I hope that there's a good way to get some value accrual in the application layer, because the application layers are valuable. Like nobody wants to interact with the protocol directly, right? You want something to like hold your hand and guide you towards making the decisions that you want to make.
Right, right. All right, let's chat about Plaza.
Sure.
I mean, we chatted a lot about like the different chains and building applications across chains. I think this moves away from that a little bit, right? And I think it's an interesting topic. So, just to kick this off, Rob Habermeier, co-founder of Polkadot, presented a plan, right, for Polkadot to consolidate functionality into a single, highly scalable system chain on Polkadot, which acts like a sort of a hub for users, developers, liquidity, applications. Um, and yeah, I mean, perhaps you can tell us a bit about this. What is Plaza, and what will make it unique to attract users and developers?
Yeah, quite a lot to say here.
Yeah,
Just kind of like, so I guess like the way I want to start is to kind of define Plaza, because I think if you ask like 20 different people what Plaza is, you'll get 20 different answers.
right.
And then also maybe give a little bit of history, right? So um, Rob's blog post was actually quite coincidental, because it really, if you break it down, it conveys two tracks that are actually independent from each other. And we've been discussing these two tracks for a long time. And we were basically kind of like arriving at the answer of Plaza when Rob independently put this forward. Um,
Mm,
and so the way that I think about it is like there's the minimal relay effort and the contracts effort. So on the minimal relay side, there's this RFC. I think it's number 32 from the fellowship, and I mean it describes something that has kind of been our plan since maybe like 2020, which is that we want to get all of the functionality off of the relay chain. It should all be in parachains. So of course, like at Genesis, Polkadot didn't have any parachains, so all of this stuff like balances and staking and governance were all in the relay chain. But our idea was always to move these into parachains. Um, and now we kind of have to anyway. This is would go into another topic, but like there is no relay chain in Jam, which is like the next iteration of Polkadot. And so anything that's in the relay chain has to be out of the relay chain to get to
mm-hmm.
Jam. But we wanted to do this anyway, partly for scalability. So we've had this effort for like 4 years of like, how do we start to move this functionality out of the relay chain and into parachains? And the model that we've had for a long time was to have multiple chains. So like to have a chain like Asset Hub that would hold balances, and then to have a chain just for governance and a chain just for staking. And if you think about like, well, what if one of those chains isn't being used, at least like not a lot, why should it take up an entire Polkadot core? Right? Like a whole parachain slot just for this one chain that like, governance chain, of course it's important, but it's not like people are doing,
Yeah.
1,000 votes per second or something, right? Like it doesn't need
That would
that
be
much.
nice.
Yeah.
That would be
Uh,
a lot of participation in governance.
yeah, it just doesn't need that throughput. And so our idea around that was like, well, we should keep the logic isolated in different chains, but we should control the resource consumption based on scheduling. So we could say that like, hey, maybe identity, governance, and staking, they can all just share one parachain slot and kind of like take turns executing blocks. And then rather than every 6 seconds, it's every 18 seconds, right? But if one of these chains got like a huge burst in its resource needs, we could just move it to another core and give it a dedicated core for some time. And then once that surge came down, we just moved it back into the shared core. So that was like, let's call it plan A for a couple of years. And as we were working on that, like especially with staking, we started to find it was a lot more complicated than we originally imagined, especially because like, you can participate in governance with the same funds that you've staked. And so we ran into this like, you have these problems like, well, if we have a staking chain and a balances chain and a governance chain, then like, you know the staking the council and staking chain are getting rewarded with their staking rewards, How do we communicate that to the asset chain to update the balance? How do we make sure that the governance chain, that the account is voting with the correct balance on the governance chain? It was a lot of stuff and then we're like, well, we could kind of give the account like a credit, like we could lock it on the assets chain and give it like a fake balance on the governance chain that wasn't like, it was basically like a voting ticket, right? But not really like a dot. Anyway, like I don't want to like bore people going into the weeds too much. It turned out to be really hard, basically. um, and and so we were kind of converging towards this idea that like, hey, we have other scaling initiatives on the core side, like this elastic scaling or like fixed factor scaling, where we could actually take one parachain and make it have like 2-second blocks or something, and like triple the throughput for like some duration of time. And, and then we're like, I think it would actually be a lot more pragmatic to put all of this stuff into one chain and make it like, like the Polkadot protocol chain. And then if that needs, like, it can consume one core for like one parachain core. And if it gets like a huge burst, we can split it and make some faster blocks and use like 2 or 3 cores for some fixed amount of time and then come back to one core. And, and then like completely in parallel, completely independent, mostly pushed by this guy Alex Tyson. We were talking about like having contracts and like especially EVM compatible contracts on Assets Hub, or like not just on Assets Hub, but like all system chains, because people wanted to write smart contracts that would participate in governance or participate in staking. And so I think it was actually like, I don't know if it was like week before, week after or something, but like Alex also put out this proposal for smart contracts on Asset Hub.
Right.
And so Rob's idea kind of like tied it together and gave it a name, Plaza. But actually, these were like 2 efforts that were going on for the last several years. And we kind of reached like the decision point where like, let's do all the minimal relay stuff in one chain instead of 5 chains, and let's do contracts. And these were like kind of 2 separate projects, and we had kind of arrived at like, yeah, we should make this decision and commit to this track. And then Rob came out with the Plaza blog post, which basically said that, more or less, and gave it the name Plaza. And so yeah, it all kind of came together nicely and got like a lot of people excited about the plan. Yeah, I guess I'll pause there. Like, no, I won't. I have one more thing. Like,
Yeah.
I think like this is maybe like more on like the marketing and communication lines, but
Right.
I do think like, I mean, Plaza was like a nice name for the blog post and stuff, and like we kind of even refer to it as like Project Plaza and stuff. But like, I do think one of the problems that people have with Polkadot is we have too many products. It's confusing
Right.
for a lot of new users, and especially like moving everything onto the same parachain where we already have stablecoins like USDT and USDC. It makes staking easier. It makes integrations with exchanges easier. It makes the user experience better. It has lower existential deposits. Like, you only need 0.01 dot for an account instead of 1 dot. It lowers the barriers of entry. So at least in my opinion, and I'm no marketing expert, we shouldn't introduce this new thing like Plaza as like this new product, right? It should just be like, hey, Polkadot is easier to use now, right? Like, it's easier to integrate. It's easier to use.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, I don't think we need to introduce like a new product or special name for it. I think it's just like, it's just the right direction to go in for Polkadot anyway.
Yeah. That's an interesting discussion. I'm not sure either. I mean, I like the point you're saying. You just keep it Polkadot. This is just Polkadot and it's better now. Or do you need fancy names to push something new in this space? I don't know. But I like the approach. It's so even though we have this kind of like modular approach, like you said, there's all these different chains and applications can be built across chains. There's still value, clearly, if this is an avenue that you guys think should be pursued. There is value in having one environment with all these tools there where users can be active and
Yeah.
developers can.
So the value really depends on like how much composability or interaction do these systems need to have. So
Mm-hmm.
the main problem with splitting up staking and governance and balances was that balances and staking and governance are all very tightly
Interlinked, yeah.
interlinked, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard to draw the line between them. or decide like how to split them up. You want a lot of composability in those systems. If you're staking and you get slashed, you want governance to know about it right away so that you don't
Yeah.
have as powerful a vote anymore. You want the update to happen right away, not eventually, right? Whereas like we still have a separate identity chain. And if you think about like how you interact with identity, you might need to, I think there's like a deposit that's 0. 0.2 dot, I think, to register an identity. But this is something you do once, right? Like you need to like transfer that dot to the people chain, you register your identity, and then that identity is like that information is linked to your account. I say forever, like until you remove it. But it's really passive at that point. Like you don't need to continue interacting with that in a synchronous way, the way that you would interact with staking or governance on a very regular basis. And same with like our collectives chain, where we have like the ambassador program and the technical fellowship. We actually expect people who are members in those collectives to be a bit more like a power user, right? Um, if you're in the technical fellowship, you should know how to use a different parachain. It's like shouldn't
Right.
be that huge of a leap.
Yeah.
And so like the idea that like, okay, well, this logic, it's very easy to kind of like compartmentalize it and move it off into another space where it can have like specialized functionality. That still, in my opinion, makes sense to have as a separate component. But like the stuff, especially like around like staking and governance and balances, is just much easier if this is all tied together in one place where people can interact with it in a much more convenient manner.
Right, right. But there will be more than that as well, right? It's supposed to be kind of like this concept of a buzzing place, like a plaza, like the center of the town, where users come together. They can do all these things, and perhaps from there things can grow out to different cores, different chains in the ecosystem, right?
Uh, yeah, I mean, like, but people doing things doesn't necessarily mean there's more functionality, right? Like, we don't need to
Right,
add anything else to it. Like, the main
right,
part is to get the core Polkadot protocol over, and it should make it easier also for like parachain developers, right? Like, right now you always have to interact with the relay chain, and you have to use dot because like the relay chain doesn't understand anything except dot, whereas like asset hub, it understands tons of different tokens, right? So like if you want to pay your fees in your own parachain token, we can convert them on the fly within asset hub, and you don't need to have like exposure to all these other steps, right? And
mhm.
so like it does make things easier basically for everybody, right? Like other parachain developers, system integration, users, and yeah, I mean, it'll be good if scalability is like the problem that we run into there.
Let's talk about scalability, because this will de facto be kind of like a layer one um, smart contract compatible layer one, which yeah, runs on Polkadot. Then has all these functionalities, and we will, the idea is to scale, to push the scalability to its limits as well, and have sort of like a showcase of what's possible. I think at least that's some of the notions that I read in Rob's blog post, like you said. Some of the quotes in there regarding scalability, where we can scale this chain to thousands of TPS today and much further over time. We can build this Plaza chain to support hundreds of millions of transactions per day over time with some engineering advances. Um, and still maintain that I suppose the nodes are normal machines with good software engineering, and they don't have high hardware requirements, which might jeopardize decentralization of the network. Yeah, just how scalable will this be?
Yeah, I mean, we'll find out, right? I think he's right about, yeah, I mean, it can easily scale to like over 1,000 transactions per second today, and should like more or less easily handle the kind of activity that we see today. It's quite, I don't want to say trivial because it's not, the work isn't done in my team, but like it's quite simple to do like a 3x scale. So to go from like a 6 second block time to a 2 second block time, this is like quite simple, and it kind of has to do with like how the 6 second block time is divided up. But like you can quite easily triple the throughput. So like, yeah, that would kind of be like the next step is like, hey, is there a surge? Let's just split this into three and switch over to 2 second block times, and we can produce a lot more. And this is all on like totally standard hardware, like nothing special. Um, Going beyond 3x is a bit more complicated. I know Rob is working on this project. I think it's called NOMT, and he might have some ideas in mind. But anything I say would be pure speculation. So I'll leave it at 3x. We can definitely do. And if Rob says we can do a lot more than that, he should come on and explain that.
Oh, we're happy to have him on. We've tried a few times, so maybe it'll happen. Yeah, right. And then this Plaza would support DOT as a gas fee as well, right? And I think the idea was to have it be minimal, so the minimum sustainable fee, but then also to have, so there's a bit of an additional use case for DOT as well. You'd have like a priority fee, I think, for ordering transactions within a block. Can
Yeah.
you just speak to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, like the ordering fee is like pretty typical across all of Substrate. You can just pretty simple configuration in your runtime that like if a block is full, you can add a tip on top of your transaction fee to try to get extra priority on your
Mm.
transaction. Um, but actually, Asset Hub, which will be the chain that becomes Plaza, this actually supports fees in any token. So as long as because there is a native DEX within the protocol. So as long as there's a pool that exists, because the protocol calculates the transaction fee in dot, right? Like the protocol just understands dot. Um, so let's say you go to submit a transaction and it calculates that the fee is going to be, like 0.01 dot. Um, it's going to say like, but you say, I don't want to pay this in dot. I want to pay it in something else. It could be a stable coin. It could be a parachain token. Could be really anything as long as there's a pool. The system will then look up and say like, well, what's the rate of that asset in the pool? And I'll just swap it in the pool and I'll take the 0.01 dot for the transaction fee, and just, dump the asset in the pool from the user. So like, from the system perspective, yes, it's only actually using dot as a transaction fee, but from the user perspective, it can
Mm.
actually accept anything because it'll just have the user deposit the asset into the pool, and the system will take dot out of the pool.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, because I wasn't sure how that worked. So you can actually use other tokens, which is lovely for user experience, but at the same time, it does support DOT, the system, as the token with which the fee is then paid in the end. Because
Yes.
that whatever, if I have USDT and I can pay the transaction fee in USDT, it's still swapped in the back end, so to say, against DOT. So it is
Yes.
being bought. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Cool. Awesome. I mean, I think we also wanted to talk a bit about the treasury and all, but we're already at 50 minutes ish, I think. So perhaps we do this on a different next time we
Yeah.
have you
Do a
on.
follow up on the treasury.
Exactly. I know there's a lot happening there. Yeah, I mean, perhaps would be interesting to also say, can you also give some indications about the stuff that you're working on, and when things might get released, even if it's a bit of a rough estimate?
Yeah, so like Agile Core Time should be on Polkadot like in September. So um, I don't know. It's early August now. I don't know how long you release these, but potentially at the release date here, we have Agile Core Time on Polkadot.
That's fair. Yeah.
So yeah, that's like the next big one. And then probably the next big thing in the runtime would be this smart contracts on Asset Hub. So we're aiming for end of year on that.
Nice.
Um, and then also by end of year, we'd like to have like a very concrete plan about how we migrate everything off the relay chain. So this is like a test environment, and then like actual instructions for like what parachains. Maybe parachains are doing like liquid staking, or like they're participating in governance via XEM. Um, have instructions for them like, hey, what do you need to do when all of this stuff moves from the relay chain to Asset Hub, and then actually make the migration in like Q1 or Q2 of next year. I think those are like the big upcoming things, and then hopefully the other things like kind of boring, but more stability, more tooling, more test environments. Try to make just quality of life for building on Polkadot better.
Yeah. Well, boring but needed for sure. Well, you said boring. I didn't say. No, that's lovely. Great. I hope we'll see a lot of applications being built, as you said, and that the ecosystem becomes more application-centric, and things are abstracted away from the users, like you said. And we'll put some links in the show notes for devs that maybe want to get started building applications on Polkadot. I'll follow up with you what links would make sense for that. Lovely to have you on the show, Joe. Any last words you'd like to share?
No, thank you for having me.
Awesome. See you soon again.